The Civil War in the United States began in 1861, after decades of simmering tensions between northern and southern states over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 caused 7 southern states to secede and form the Confederate States of America, for more states soon joined them. The war between the states, as the Civil War was also known, ended in Confederate surrender in 1865. The conflict was the costliest and deadliest war ever fought on American soil, with some 620,000 of 2.4 million soldiers killed, millions more injured, and much of the South left in ruin. November 6, 1860. Abraham Lincoln, who had declared government cannot endure permanently half slave, half free, is elected president. The first Republican, receiving 180 of 303 possible electoral votes and 40% of the popular vote. December 20, 1860. South Carolina secedes from the Union, followed within 2 months by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. February 9, 1861. The Confederate States of America is formed with Jefferson Davis, a West Point graduate and former U.S. Army officer, as president. March 4, 1861. Abraham Lincoln is sworn in as 16th President of the United States of America. April 12, 1861. At 4:30 a.m., Confederates under General Pierre Beauregard opened fire with 50 cannons upon Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. The Civil War begins. April 15, 1861. President Lincoln issues a proclamation calling for 75,000 militiamen and summoning a special session of Congress for July 4th. Robert Lee, son of a Revolutionary War hero and a 25-year distinguished veteran of the United States Army and former superintendent of West Point, is offered command of the Union Army. Lee declines. April 17, 1861. Virginia secedes from the Union, followed within 5 weeks by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, thus forming an 11-state confederacy with a population of 9 million, including nearly 4 million slaves. April 19, 1861. President Lincoln issues a proclamation of blockade against southern ports. For the duration of the war, the blockade limits the ability of the rural South to stay well supplied in its war against the industrialized North. April 20, 1861. Robert Lee resigns his commission in the United States Army. Lee then goes to Richmond, Virginia, is offered command of the military and naval forces of Virginia, and accepts. July 4, 1861. Lincoln, in a speech to Congress, states the war is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men. The Congress authorizes a call for 500,000 men. July 21, 1861. The Union Army under General Irvin McDowell suffers a defeat at Bull Run, 25 miles southwest of Washington. Union troops fall back to Washington. President Lincoln realizes the war will be long. "It's damn bad," he comments. July 27, 1861. President Lincoln appoints George McClellan as commander of the Department of the Potomac, replacing McDowell. September 11, 1861. President Lincoln revokes General John Fremont's unauthorized military proclamation of emancipation in Missouri. Later, the president relieves General Fremont of his command and replaces him with General David Hunter. November 1, 1861. President Lincoln appoints McClellan as General-in-Chief of all Union forces after the resignation of the aged Winfield Scott. November 8, 1861. The beginning of an international diplomatic crisis for President Lincoln as 2 Confederate officials sailing toward England are seized by the U.S. Navy. England, the leading world power, demands their release, threatening war. Lincoln eventually gives in and orders their release in December. January 31, 1862. President Lincoln issues General War Order No. 1. Calling for all United States naval and land forces to begin a general advance by February 22, George Washington's birthday. February 6, 1862. Victory for General Ulysses Grant in Tennessee, capturing Fort Henry, and 10 days later Fort Donelson. Grant earns the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. February 20th, 1862. President Lincoln is struck with grief as his beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, dies from fever, probably caused by polluted drinking water in the White House. March 8, 1862. The Confederate ironclad Merrimac sinks 2 wooden Union ships, then battles the Union ironclad Monitor to a draw. Naval warfare is thus changed forever, making wooden ships obsolete. In March, the Peninsular Campaign begins as McClellan's Army of the Potomac advances from Washington down the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay to the peninsula south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. President Lincoln temporarily relieves McClellan as General-in-Chief and takes direct command of the Union armies. April 6, 1862. Confederate surprise attack on General Ulysses Grant's unprepared troops at Shiloh on the Tennessee River results in a bitter struggle, with 13,000 Union killed and wounded and 10,000 Confederates. April 24, 1862. 17 Union ships under the command of Flag Officer David Farragut move up the Mississippi River, then take New Orleans, the South's greatest seaport. Later in the war, sailing through a rebel minefield, Farragut utters the famous phrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." May 31, 1862. The Battle of Seven Pines as General Joseph Johnston's army attacks McClellan's troops in front of Richmond and nearly defeats them, but Johnston is badly wounded. June 1, 1862. General Robert Lee assumes command, replacing the wounded Johnston. Lee then renames his force the Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan is not impressed, saying Lee is likely to be timid and irresolute in action. June 25 to July 1, 1862. The 7 days battles as Lee attacks McClellan near Richmond, resulting in very heavy losses for both armies. McClellan then begins a withdrawal back toward Washington. July 11, 1862. After 4 months as his own General-in-Chief, President Lincoln hands over the task to General Henry Halleck. August 29, 1862. 75,000 Federals under General John Pope are defeated by 55,000 Confederates under General Stonewall Jackson and General James Longstreet at the Second Battle of Bull Run in Northern Virginia. September 4 to September 9, 1862. Lee invades the North with 50,000 Confederates and heads for Harper's Ferry, located 50 miles northwest of Washington. The Union Army, 90,000 strong, under the command of McClellan, pursues Lee. September 17, 1862. The bloodiest day in U.S. military history as General Robert Lee and the Confederate armies are stopped at Antietam in Maryland by McClellan and numerically superior Union forces. By nightfall, 26,000 men are dead, wounded, or missing. Lee then withdraws to Virginia. September 22, 1862. Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves issued by President Lincoln. November 7, 1862. The President replaces McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside as the new commander of the Army of the Potomac. December 13, 1862. Army of the Potomac under General Burnside suffers a costly defeat at Fredericksburg in Virginia, with a loss of 12,653 men after 14 frontal assaults on well-entrenched rebels on Marye's Heights. "We might as well have tried to take hell," a Union soldier remarks. Confederate losses are 5,309. January 1, 1863. President Lincoln issues the final Emancipation Proclamation freeing all slaves in territories held by Confederates and emphasizes the enlisting of black soldiers in the Union Army. The war to preserve the Union now becomes a revolutionary struggle for the abolition of slavery. January 25, 1863. The President appoints General Joseph Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac, replacing Burnside. January 29, 1863. General Grant is placed in command of the Army of the West, with orders to capture Vicksburg. March 3, 1863. The U.S. Congress enacts a draft affecting male citizens aged 20 to 45, but also exempts those who pay $300 or provide a substitute. May 1 to May 4, 1863. The Union Army under General Hooker is decisively defeated by Lee's much smaller forces at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia as a result of Lee's brilliant and daring tactics. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson is mortally wounded by his own soldiers. Hooker retreats. Union losses are 17,000 killed, wounded, and missing out of 130,000. The Confederates, 13,000 out of 60,000. May 10, 1863. The South suffers a huge blow as Stonewall Jackson dies from his wounds. His last words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." June 3, 1863. General Lee with 75,000 Confederates launches his second invasion of the North, heading into Pennsylvania in a campaign that will soon lead to Gettysburg. June 28, 1863. President Lincoln appoints General George Meade as commander of the Army of the Potomac, replacing Hooker. Meade is the fifth man to command the Army in less than a year. July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. The tide of war turns against the South as the Confederates are defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. July 4th, 1863. Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, surrenders to General Grant and the Army of the West after a 6-week siege. July 13th to July 16th, 1863. Anti-draft riots in New York City include arson and the murder of blacks by poor immigrant whites. At least 120 persons are killed and $2 million in damage caused, until Union soldiers returning from Gettysburg restore order. July 18, 1863. Black troops of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment under Colonel Robert Shaw assault fortified rebels at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. Colonel Shaw and half of the 600 men in the regiment are killed. August 10, 1863. The president meets with abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who pushes for full equality for Union black troops. August 21, 1863. At Lawrence, Kansas, pro-Confederate William Quantrill and 450 pro-slavery followers raid the town and butcher 182 boys and men. September 19, 1863. A decisive Confederate victory by General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee at Chickamauga leaves General William Rosecrans' Union Army of the Cumberland trapped in Chattanooga, Tennessee under Confederate siege. October 16, 1863. The President appoints General Grant to command all operations in the Western Theater. November 19, 1863. President Lincoln delivers a 2-minute Gettysburg address at a ceremony dedicating the battlefield as a national cemetery. November 23 to November 25, 1863. The rebel siege of Chattanooga ends as Union forces under Grant defeat the siege army of General Braxton Bragg. March 9, 1864. President Lincoln appoints General Grant to command all of the armies of the United States. General William Sherman succeeds Grant as commander in the West. May 4, 1864. The beginning of a massive, coordinated campaign involving all the Union armies. In Virginia, Grant, with an army of 120,000, begins advancing toward Richmond to engage Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, now numbering 64,000, beginning a war of attrition that will include major battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. June 3, 1864. A costly mistake by Grant results in 7,000 Union casualties in 20 minutes during an offensive against fortified rebels at Cold Harbor in Virginia. June 15, 1864. Union forces miss an opportunity to capture Petersburg and cut off the Confederate rail lines. As a result, a 9-month siege of Petersburg begins with Grant's forces surrounding Lee. July 20, 1864. At Atlanta, Sherman's forces battle the rebels now under the command of General John Hood, who replaced Johnston. August 29, 1864. Democrats nominate George McClellan for president to run against Republican incumbent Abraham Lincoln. September 2, 1864. Atlanta is captured by Sherman's army. "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," Sherman telegraphs Lincoln. The victory greatly helps President Lincoln's bid for re-election. October 19, 1864. A decisive Union victory by Cavalry General Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley over Jubal Early's troops. November 8, 1864. Abraham Lincoln is re-elected president, defeating Democrat George McClellan. Lincoln carries all but 3 states with 55% of the popular vote and 212 of 233 electoral votes. November 15, 1864. After destroying Atlanta's warehouses and railroad facilities, Sherman, with 62,000 men, begins a march to the sea. December 15, 1864. Hood's rebel army of 23,000 is crushed at Nashville by 55,000 Federals, including Negro troops under General George Thomas. The Confederate Army of Tennessee ceases as an effective fighting force. December 21, 1864. Sherman reaches Savannah in Georgia, leaving behind a 300-mile-long path of destruction 60 miles wide all the way from Atlanta. Sherman then telegraphs Lincoln, offering him Savannah as a Christmas present. January 31, 1865. The U.S. Congress approves the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to abolish slavery. The amendment is then submitted to the states for ratification. February 3, 1865. A peace conference occurs as President Lincoln meets with Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens at Hampton Roads in Virginia, but the meeting ends in failure. The war will continue. March 4, 1865. Inauguration ceremonies for President Lincoln in Washington. March 25, 1865. The last offensive for Lee's Army of Northern Virginia begins with an attack on the center of Grant's forces at Petersburg. 4 hours later, the attack is broken. April 2, 1865. Grant's forces begin a general advance and break through Lee's lines at Petersburg. Confederate General Ambrose Hill is killed. Lee evacuates Petersburg. The Confederate capital, Richmond, is evacuated. Fires and looting break out. The next day, Union troops enter and raise the Stars and Stripes. April 4, 1865. President Lincoln tours Richmond, where he enters the Confederate White House. April 9, 1865. General Robert Lee surrenders his Confederate army to General Ulysses Grant at the village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Grant allows rebel officers to keep their sidearms and permits soldiers to keep horses and mules. April 10, 1865. Celebrations break out in Washington. April 14, 1865. The Stars and Stripes is ceremoniously raised over Fort Sumter. That night, Lincoln and his wife Mary see the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. At 10:13 p.m., during the third act of the play, John Wilkes Booth shoots the president in the head. Doctors attend to the president in the theater, then move him to a house across the street. He never regains consciousness. April 15, 1865. President Abraham Lincoln dies at 7:22 in the morning. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency. April 18, 1865. Confederate General Joseph Johnston surrenders to Sherman near Durham in North Carolina. April 26, 1865. John Wilkes Booth is shot and killed in a tobacco barn in Virginia. May 4, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, outside Springfield, Illinois. In May, remaining Confederate forces surrender. The nation is reunited as the Civil War ends. Over 620,000 Americans died in the war, with disease killing twice as many as those lost in battle. 50,000 survivors return home as amputees. December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, passed by Congress on January 31, 1865, is finally ratified. Slavery is abolished.